Right in the middle of the United States is a quiet little town called Millstadt, Illinois. Millstadt is home to about 4,000 people, and had it not been for Ashley Reeves, only those 4,000 people and their friends and family would even know that Millstadt existed. In 2006, Ashley Reeves was a 17-year-old high school student who lived with her parents and her younger sister Casey in Millstadt. Ashley was an excellent student who, even though she was over a year from her high school graduation, she was already thinking about what colleges she wanted to go to. She was also extremely likable and outgoing, and she had this huge, infectious smile, and so she had tons of friends, and she had a very serious boyfriend who her parents adored. His name was Jeremy, and he was a high school student as well. On the morning of Thursday, April 27th of that year, Ashley got up and, like every other morning, she got ready for school alongside her sister Casey. And then right before Ashley stepped out to head off to school, she told her parents that after school, she had a job interview on the other side of town. And then after her interview, her plan was to play basketball with some friends and then she'd be home. And so her parents said, okay, well, hey, good luck with your job interview and just make sure you're home before 10:30 p.m. And so Ashley said, no problem, I'll see you tonight, and then she left. That afternoon, after school, Ashley made her way to Jeremy's locker, and when she got to him, Jeremy handed her his keys to his car. He had an SUV, and he was lending it to her for the day so she could go to the interview and then go play basketball. And so Ashley took the keys, she thanked him, she gave him a hug, and then she turned and she walked down the hallway where she met up with her sister Casey at her locker. And then the two girls left the school, they went out to the student parking lot, they found Jeremy's SUV, they hopped inside, and then Ashley began driving them back to their house. When they got there, Casey hopped out of the car, she said bye to Ashley, and then Ashley left their house and she began driving to Fairview Heights, which was a town about 15 miles away where her interview was going to be. Several hours later, around 10 p.m., Ashley's parents had not heard from their daughter, and it was getting close to her curfew, and so they asked Casey if she had spoken with Ashley, and, did she know how her interview went? Did she know when she was going to be home? But Casey would tell them, actually, no, I haven't talked to Ashley since she dropped me off from school. And so Ashley's parents said, okay, no big deal, and they called Ashley, but Ashley didn't pick up. So they sent her a series of text messages, but after a couple of minutes of not getting any response, they decided to just call her boyfriend Jeremy to see if maybe he knew what was going on with Ashley. But when they spoke to Jeremy, he would say that, I haven't spoken with Ashley since I gave her the keys to my SUV, and I've actually been trying to talk to her all day. I've been calling her and texting her, but I still haven't heard back. And so at this point, Ashley's parents were starting to get really worried. And so after hanging up with Jeremy, they began calling other friends of Ashley's to see if maybe they had spoken to her and knew what was going on. But all of her friends that they spoke to all had the same story. We haven't talked to her since the end of school and she's not returning our calls or texts. And so Ashley's mother, she just sensed that something was terribly wrong. And so without any hesitation, she just called the police. Now, the police in this town were used to getting calls every now and again from parents whose teenage child had run off and they were concerned about them, but virtually every time the police investigated, they would find the teenager had just kind of been blowing off their friends and family, and they would pop up maybe a couple hours later totally unharmed. But the Millstadt police would later remark when they heard Ashley's mother's voice over the phone, the fear in her voice was so pronounced, it immediately pushed the police department to take this case very seriously. And so that night, right after this phone call, the Millstadt Police Department went out in force to try to locate Jeremy's SUV, the car that Ashley had been driving around that day. And the first place they went to look for this car was Latterman Park, which is this very popular public park that has a really popular basketball court that lots of teenagers would go to all the time, and Ashley was known to frequent that park. And this park was located about halfway between Fairview Heights, where her interview was, and Millstadt, where she lived. And so they go to Latterman Park, and right away, sitting in the parking lot, they find Jeremy's SUV. But Ashley is not in the car, she's nowhere near the car, and when they searched the car, there was nothing of significance inside of it. There was just some of Ashley's clothes lying around. The police would spend all night and well into the morning combing Latterman Park looking for any sign of Ashley, but there wasn't one, and so as the sun came up and the police were nowhere closer to finding this girl, they began to suspect that, perhaps foul play was involved. And so the first person they hauled in for questioning was Ashley's boyfriend, Jeremy. But as soon as he sat in the interrogation room, he demonstrated a real concern for Ashley. He had a rock-solid alibi, and he basically was an open book. And so they quickly ruled him out as a suspect. And then the police basically began hauling in all of Ashley's friends and acquaintances and family members, basically anybody that knew her. They were bringing them into the station to find out if they knew anything that could help them figure out where Ashley was. And more specifically, the police were really looking to see if any of these people were hiding something. And sure enough, a few of the friends that were brought in were. According to a few of Ashley's closest friends, Ashley was in not one, but two romantic relationships. One was the public relationship she had with Jeremy, and the other was a secret relationship that was actually illegal. In order to hide this forbidden second relationship, Ashley would tell her family and her friends that she was going to the park to play basketball, when in reality, she was going to the park to meet up with this secret second partner. And the day before, when Ashley went missing, her friends told police that that was the exact reason she was going to Latterman Park. The police got the name of this secret person from Ashley's friends. His name was Sam Shelton, and the police tracked him down. When they found him, he was at a baseball practice, but the police didn't care. They marched right on to the baseball diamond, and they grabbed Sam and they brought him back to the police station. And then when he got there, they sat him down in the interrogation room, and he's still wearing his baseball uniform, and they asked him about his relationship with Ashley. And he immediately denies it and says he does not have a relationship with Ashley. He's got no idea why he's here. But pretty quickly, after a few questions, Sam's answers became inconsistent. And so the police just ratcheted up the pressure on him. And then finally, after 12 hours of questioning, the interrogator brings up Sam's mother and his grandmother. And he says to Sam, how would they feel if they knew you were lying to the police right now? And this just broke Sam. And so he cracked. Now, at this point, the police were already expecting the worst when it came to Ashley, but they were not ready for just how brutal Sam's confession would be about what exactly he did to her. The following is an account based on his confession. 30 hours earlier, Ashley wrapped up her interview in Fairview Heights, and she made her way to Latterman Park to meet up with Sam. And now it's not clear exactly how they met up, but eventually the two of them did connect and they made their way over to Sam's car where they became intimate. Afterwards, the two are sitting in the front two seats of Sam's car. Sam is in the driver's seat and Ashley is in the passenger seat. And while they're sitting there, something happens that causes this huge fight between the two of them. And at some point, Sam tells Ashley to get out of the car. But Ashley refuses. She wants to talk to him. She wants to deal with their issues, but Sam's not having it. And so he gets so mad at her that he lunges across the center console of the car and he puts Ashley into a vicious chokehold. Now, he tells police his plan was to kind of yank her out of the car, but he squeezed so hard around her neck that he heard this loud popping sound coming from her neck. It was the sound of her neck breaking. And so as soon as he heard it, Sam let go, and Ashley kind of crumpled forward and hit the front dashboard of the car. And so Sam is staring at her, wondering what he should do. He's kind of looking around, making sure no one saw what he just did. And then he reached over and lifted her back up to see if she was still alive, and he saw she was. But instead of trying to get her help, he decides right then and there he's going to kill her. And so he reaches over and he begins choking her. But after several minutes of throttling her, she just wouldn't die. And so Sam pulled his belt off of his waist and he wrapped it around Ashley's neck. And then he began pulling. But he would tell police he couldn't stand looking at Ashley's face while he did this. He said she was staring right at him, her tongue was coming out of her mouth, she was frothing, and her face was turning this ghastly shade of gray-blue. And so at some point, when she still hadn't died, he released the belt from around her neck, and he turned her body so she was facing the window away from him, and then he repositioned the belt on her neck, and then he put his foot on her back to use as leverage, and then he pulled as hard as you possibly could on her throat for quite a while until the belt actually broke around her neck. And then at that point, he checked to make sure she was dead, and when she was, he stuffed her down into the floorboards in front of the passenger seat, and then he drove several miles across town to another park called Citizens Park that was very heavily forested. And once he parked in the parking lot, he looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he dragged Ashley's body out of the car and deep into the woods where he abandoned her. It would turn out Ashley was far from the only teenage girl who found Sam Shelton attractive. Many teenage girls in the area thought he was the perfect catch. He was smart, he was handsome, and he had these beautiful, striking blue eyes that you couldn't help but just stare at. However, there was something unique about Sam that made him fundamentally different than all the other guys at their schools. Sam was not a student. He was a 27-year-old middle school teacher in Millstadt, and he also was the high school baseball coach. He had never been Ashley's teacher directly. However, years earlier when she was in middle school, he had begun grooming her for exploitation. And so fast forward to 2006 when she was 17, he had effectively manipulated her into believing she was in this romantic relationship with him, when in reality, he was just using his position of power to abuse her. In addition to being a school teacher, Sam was also an aspiring pro wrestler. He would often compete in local showcases under the nickname The Teacher. While Sam was probably nowhere near good enough to actually become a professional wrestler like you would see on TV, he was extremely strong and really knew how to do a chokehold. And so when he attacked Ashley and put her in that vicious chokehold, she had no chance at escaping. She was completely doomed. Shortly after his confession, Sam would tell the police that he would take them out into the forest of Citizens Park to try to find Ashley's body. But when they got there, it was late, it had been raining for several hours, and Sam right away acted like he couldn't figure out exactly where he had left her. And so the police were actually starting to think, is he lying to us? Is this whole thing just kind of made up? Did he really attack her? Is she really out here? But after about 30 minutes of the police and Sam kind of trudging around the thick forest, one of the officers suddenly sees something on the ground. He raises his flashlight, and there in a clearing is Ashley's body. And so the police and Sam, they walk over to her and they're standing above her ruined body. Her neck is totally bent at a grotesque angle. She's covered in bugs. But as they're standing there and they're watching her, her chest suddenly starts to move. She wasn't dead. She had been left for dead, and she had been out in the woods with a broken neck for 30 hours in the freezing cold and the rain. She only had a t-shirt and some pants on, but she was alive. And so moments later, the paramedics, they come rushing into the forest, they pick her up really gently, they bring her out and they rush her to the hospital where she'd be put into a medically induced coma. The doctors would tell her family that unfortunately her injuries were just too serious and we don't expect her to ever wake up again. But miraculously, she would. Now, she would have to relearn how to walk and talk and eat and drink, but she would do all of those things, and today she is 32 years old, she is happily married, she has 2 kids of her own, and by and large, she leads a very happy, normal life. As for Sam Shelton, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, and he's still in prison today. However, he is up for parole in 2024. The next and final story of today's episode is called What Happened in Room 348. On September 15, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. But in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard, and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead, there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants, and then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room, and he put it at the foot of the bed, and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week, and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook, and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans, and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough. Put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband. And he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone and they said, hey, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the 2 coworkers head over to the hotel. They knock on Greg's door. He doesn't answer. And so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door. And right away, they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face, and his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his 2 left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the 2 coworkers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something. So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only 2 marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood, food from his intestines had been ripped outside, he had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them, but Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those 2 things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide, and my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him. When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk, and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative, and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed, and they went outside in the hall and they saw Greg, and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband. And Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived, and he sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues had been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah. Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. He never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene, he showed him the hotel room, and then afterwards he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos, and the next day when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, I think I figured it out. And Apple's like, oh really, you figured it out one day after being here? And Ken's like, no, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory. And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple, and when Susie picks up, Ken's like, hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand or did he smoke with his right hand? And Susie said, oh no, he only smoked with his right hand. And Ken goes, thank you very much. He hangs up and he goes, Apple, I got it. And so Apple's like, okay, what's your theory? And Ken says, okay, so I spoke to Susie and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly, and as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, oh, I didn't turn the AC back on, and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him. And Ken puts his hand up and he says, I know, I'm just building the whole picture here. Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that. And he jumps off the bed and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground, and his cigarette's still in his fingers, and he dies. And Apple's like, you know what, that's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die? Ken's like, I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true. So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground. And then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says, there. And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, that's just from the doorknob. And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, hold on, and he goes outside. He goes next door to room 349. They go inside, and Apple walks in the room and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops and he looks up at Apple and he takes his finger and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out there was a hole in the heart, and it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body, Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake, and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more, I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha, because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun. Otherwise, I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Muller, they were goofing around and drinking that night. And Muller went out and got his pistol from his car and he brought it in. And he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine, and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately Muller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison. The late afternoon of December 11th, 2006, 30-year-old Rafaela Castagna glanced out the upstairs window of her condo that was located in the center of Erba, a small and well-to-do town in northern Italy. The weather had been beautiful all day, but since she needed to go out to the store to pick up a few things for dinner, she reflexively was looking outside to make sure the sun was still out. When she saw that it was, she turned around, grabbed her coat off of a nearby chair, and then walked into the kitchen to say a quick goodbye to her mother and her 2-year-old son, Yusuf. Her mother, 60-year-old Paolo Galli, was sitting in a chair next to little Yusuf, who was busy drawing pictures at the table with thick-colored crayons. Rafaela gave her son a kiss on the head and then asked her mom if there was anything she needed at the store since she'd be there anyways. Paula, who was an attractive woman with light brown hair pushed behind her ears, looked up for a minute from Yusuf's scribbles and told her daughter that maybe she should pick up some clementines and a little cake for Yusuf. And other than that, if Rafaela got the loaf of bread and bottle of wine along with the vegetables they'd need to make pasta that evening, they'd be all set. Rafaela smiled and nodded, and then thanked her mom for looking after Yusuf for a bit, and then she turned and headed towards the door of her condo, where she took a shopping bag from the hook off the wall and slipped it over her shoulder. After calling out a final goodbye to her mom and son, Rafaela stepped outside of her apartment onto a narrow balcony that stretched the length of their 3-room unit. To her left was the stairway that led both down to the cobblestone courtyard below, and also there was a stairwell that went up to the attic apartment right above her condo, where Mr. and Mrs. Cherubini lived. Before heading for the stairs, Rafaela just walked forward and leaned up against the railing and surveyed the courtyard right in front of her. Her apartment was part of a very old complex of condo units clustered around this rectangular courtyard right in front of her, where residents parked their cars. Some of the 7 buildings that made up this complex were 6 stories tall, while others were just 3 stories tall. Rafaela's apartment was located on the 2nd floor of one of the buildings that had 3 stories. It was a renovated farmhouse with pale stone walls that looked yellow in the afternoon sun. To her right, at the far end of the courtyard, was a gate that led out to a narrow road called Via Diaz that left the courtyard and wound around the outside of the condo complex and led down to the shops and restaurants in town. The single window in Yusuf's bedroom and the window in the master bedroom that Rafaela shared with her husband looked out over this road via Diaz, and Rafaela's son loved to stand at those windows hoping to catch a glimpse of a big truck as it drove by. From her perch on the balcony, Rafaela looked up and over the roofs of the condo in front of her. In the distance, she could see the purple outline of the Alps, the mountain range that separated her town from their neighbors, France to the east and Switzerland and Austria to the north. But like most of the other 16,000 or so inhabitants of Erba, Rafaela didn't really notice all the beautiful sights around her that made Erba and other small Italian towns popular to tourists. Instead, as she stood there at the balcony railing, all she could think about was just how happy she was now that her family had finally started speaking to each other again. For almost 3 years, ever since her relationship with her 25-year-old Tunisian husband, Azouz Marzouk, had started getting serious, her father and 2 brothers had basically stopped talking to her. Rafaela had always been more rebellious than her 2 brothers, and her family, who were all devout Catholics, had not been happy when she converted to Islam and married Azouz. But when Yusuf was born, Rafaela's mother saw just how much Azouz cared for the little boy, and it changed her mind about him. And in time, she fully accepted her daughter's life decisions, and from that point onward, she did her best to be the most supportive grandmother she could possibly be. And recently, Rafaela's father, Carlos, who owned a successful local furniture company, he had also finally started coming around too. And while of course this made Rafaela extremely happy, it was actually little Yusuf, with his dark hair and dark eyes and bright smile, who was the happiest about this new family dynamic, because he adored his grandparents, and his grandparents totally adored him. Recently, Yusuf's grandfather had sent some of his workers over to Rafaela's condo to install some soundproofing. This way, Yusuf could play on the floor of his bedroom with his beloved trucks and push toys without disturbing the neighbors. Yusuf was extremely pleased about this. At some point, Rafaela pushed herself up from the railing, she buttoned her coat, and then she walked down the stairs to the courtyard. As she left the courtyard and turned onto Via Diaz, heading for her favorite local market, Rafaela nodded and smiled at some of her neighbors who were also out for a walk. Rafaela enjoyed the chance to walk into town by herself, going as slowly or quickly as she wanted. She had recently landed a good part-time job at an assisted living community for the disabled, and while she loved the work, at times it could be so hectic that it was nice to get away and be alone whenever she could. After making the walk into town, Rafaela got the things she needed from the store, and then she began the walk back home. As she neared the gate that would take her back into the courtyard, Rafaela greeted and waved to a few more neighbors who looked like they were heading into town themselves. Rafaela felt like she knew everyone who lived in her apartment complex, from the friendly volunteer firefighter to the garbage collector and his tiny wife who cleaned houses for a living, to Mrs. Cherubini, who worked in sales, and her husband, 63-year-old Mr. Cherubini, who couldn't wait for his wife to retire. As Rafaela crossed the courtyard and began walking up the steps to her condo, she wondered what her neighbors thought of her when they saw her walk by. When she reached her door, she used her key and she opened it up, and then once she stepped inside, she called out to her mother and to Yusuf to let them know that she was home. Yusuf came pattering down the hallway to greet her. Rafaela scooped him up and gave him a kiss, and then while carrying her son and the groceries, she headed into the kitchen to see her mother. Once she was there, she and her mother chatted while they began preparing dinner, and while Yusuf giggled and ran around knocking over blocks and riding his scooter, the kitchen slowly filled with the smell of olive oil and fresh garlic. A little while later, at about 8:20 p.m. that night, 2 of Rafaela's neighbors were out for an evening walk. It was a clear night, and the temperature had dropped to a cool 45 degrees Fahrenheit. As the 2 men stepped out of the courtyard onto Via Diaz, they followed the road as it turned right and brought them right alongside the backside of the building that Rafaela's apartment was in. As the 2 men walked, one of them smelled smoke and looked up at the building right next to them, and they could see flames licking against the glass of one of the windows in Rafaela's apartment. After signaling the other neighbor to look up as well, they watched as the glass broke from the heat of the fire, and then smoke began pouring out into the night air. Both men immediately sprang into action. They turned around and they raced back into the courtyard, and as they ran, they pulled out their phones to call the fire department that was located just over a mile away. As they raced up the stairs and then reached the second-floor landing, they saw a very badly injured man laying on the ground right in front of them. The door to Rafaela's burning apartment was open, and the injured man was laying across the threshold. His head was inside the apartment, and his legs were outside on the landing. The two neighbors rushed over and grabbed the man's ankles and dragged him as far from the open door as they could. As they did, they heard a woman's scream coming from the attic apartment that was located directly above Rafaela's apartment. It was clear the upstairs apartment had caught fire as well. The injured man nodded his head helplessly towards the outside stairs that led up to this attic apartment, but when the two neighbors looked up at the third floor and saw the apartment above, there was so much smoke and fire coming out of the windows that they knew it would have been suicide to try to go up there and save whoever was screaming. And so with no time to feel bad about that, the two neighbors turned their focus to the open doorway to Rafaela's apartment. One of the men stepped inside the very smoky apartment, and after taking only a few steps, he saw there was a woman lying motionless on the ground, and her skin and clothes were on fire. As the neighbors pulled her out onto the landing by her ankles and tried to extinguish the flames on her, they looked up and saw the fire inside of Rafaela's apartment had finally reached the front entryway. So the men knew that even if there were more people trapped inside of Rafaela's apartment, there was no way they could get to them. By the time the fire department arrived just minutes later, the terrible screaming in the attic apartment had stopped, and the two neighbors, who were now coughing and filthy, could see that the woman they had pulled from the apartment who had been on fire was 30-year-old Rafaela Castagna, and she was dead. As the firefighters and emergency medical personnel took over, the two neighbors who had done their best to save the people in the fire stumbled back down the stairs and out into the courtyard, shocked and horrified by what they had just seen and experienced. Meanwhile, both the courtyard and the street running alongside the back of the condo via Diaz were filling up with neighbors and curious bystanders. Some were taking pictures with their phones, but most just stared upward at the firefighters climbing up the ladder truck trying to make their way into the burning apartment. Once the fire was finally out, medical personnel and police went inside to see if anyone else had been in there, and unfortunately there had been. One by one, 3 more bodies were brought outside. The first was Rafaela's mother, Paula, who had been found halfway down the hallway that connected the entrance of the condo to the kitchen and living area. The second was the Castagna's 55-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Cherubini, who had been the woman screaming in the attic apartment. And the third and final stretcher that came out carried the small body of Rafaela's 2-year-old son, Yusuf. The only survivor, Mr. Cherubini, who had been pulled out onto the landing by the 2 men who first reported the blaze, he had been rushed to the hospital in the nearby city of Como, and it was unclear if he was going to survive. Late on the night of the fire, Rafaela's father learned the terrible news. In a voice so choked with tears that you could barely understand what he was saying, Carlos called Rafaela's 2 brothers and told them, "Your mother and sister and Yusuf, their neighbor, Mrs. Cherubini, they are dead. All 4 of them are dead." After the 4 bodies were loaded into ambulances and taken to the medical examiner's office, where a doctor would perform autopsies to determine the cause of death, police tried unsuccessfully to disperse the crowd of spectators in the courtyard and out on the road on the other side of the condo. So instead, police just used yellow tape to set up a clear perimeter around the burned-out apartment to at least keep people at a distance. As the police and arson investigators, who were dressed in full-body protective gear, started lugging lights and equipment into the ruined unit, the mood amongst the residents who were still gathered outside in the courtyard quickly turned from shock to concern. Neighbors began speculating about how the fire could have started and spread so quickly, and how none of the victims appeared to have even tried to escape or call for help. Soon, neighbors were wondering out loud if there was more to these tragic deaths than just an accidental house fire. But the police and other authority figures who were on scene were not speculating, and the 2 neighbors who had been first on the scene and who might have been able to give the residents more information, they were not there to answer any questions either, because they had gone to the police station to tell law enforcement what they had seen. But within 72 hours, the worst fears of the Castañas neighbors were confirmed. The initial investigation by police and arson inspectors, along with an examination of the 4 bodies, revealed that the victims had actually been murdered and that the apartment had been set on fire to cover up evidence of what the Italian press had dubbed the Erba massacre. In the initial police reconstruction of the crime, Mr. and Mrs. Cherubini, the Castañas neighbors who lived above them in the attic apartment, they had likely smelled smoke and had rushed down the outside stairs from their apartment to the Castañas to see if something was wrong. But once they reached that second-floor landing, the Cherubinis must have stumbled into the perpetrator who had just killed Rafaela, her mother, and Yusuf and set the fire and was now trying to flee. And so the murderer must have seen the Cherubinis and attacked, first striking Mr. Cherubini down, leaving him for dead in the doorway, and then chasing Mrs. Cherubini back up the stairs into her attic apartment, where the murderer attacked her too, leaving her trapped and incapacitated before the fire killed her. Given that the first body found inside of Rafaela's apartment was Rafaela, and that the door did not show any signs of a forced entry, police suspected that Rafaela must have recognized the perpetrator and opened the door for them. The only person who could confirm or deny any of these details was Mr. Cherubini, and while he had survived the attack, after reaching the hospital, he had fallen into a coma, and so he had not been able to tell police or anybody what had actually happened. After the news broke about the murders, the police flooded Rafaela's apartment complex and began interviewing everyone. Did the Castañas have any enemies? Did you see anyone strange walking around the apartment complex that night? Did you see any of the Castañas that night? And if so, what were they doing or who were they talking to? But even as investigators carried out these constant interviews with neighbors and continued sifting through all of the evidence in the burned-out apartment for clues to the killer's identity, the investigators' real attention was actually focused on Rafaela's husband, Aziz. He had not been home at the time of the fire, and his whereabouts were unknown. Police weren't the only ones to suspect Aziz. As everyone in Erba seemed to know, Rafaela's husband had only recently been released from prison that year under a mass pardon by the government. Aziz had been serving time for dealing drugs, and so the investigators and people in Erba were suspicious that his drug ties may have had something to do with the murders. And the Italian media seemed to think the same thing. And so they quickly began running these stories that more or less declared that Aziz was either involved in the murders or that he was the murderer. But it would turn out Aziz had a rock-solid alibi. Within a few days of the murders, Aziz arrived back in Erba from his parents' home in Tunisia, where he said he had been visiting at the time of the murders. He said as soon as he heard that his family had been killed, he jumped on a plane and headed back to Italy. But even with this rock-solid alibi, the police still felt like Aziz could be a suspect, but without any evidence to support this theory, they did have to start looking elsewhere. So without any other leads to chase down, investigators again turned to the Castañas' neighbors in hopes of finding any new information that could help them solve this case, which by now had become a major national media sensation. And when the police went back, for the most part, people had really nice things to say about the Castañas. But as police dug deeper and deeper and asked people more and more questions, they eventually started hearing about a feud that the Castañas had with their next-door neighbors, Olindo and his wife, Rosa. Olindo was a large, awkward, and shy man who left early each day for his job as a garbage collector, and Rosa was a tiny, dark-haired woman whose house-cleaning services were very much in demand. Now, when the police learned that this potential feud the Castañas had was with Olindo and Rosa, they almost didn't follow up because they had already spoken to this totally unassuming, quiet couple, and they learned that they were gone at the time of the fire and whenever the murders happened, and like everyone else, they had seemed very upset about what happened to the Castañas, and whatever issues they had with the Castañas had to be fairly minor. But at this point, the police had so little to go on, they decided they would follow up and they would ask the middle-aged couple to come into the station for another round of questioning. And so the couple happily agreed, and before long they were sitting in a room at the station ready to talk about whatever the police wanted. And over the course of the subsequent conversation, this couple would tell a truly unbelievable story that would not only shock the police, it would shock the world. Based on their story and on subsequent evidence and testimony that their story helped uncover, the police were able to piece together almost exactly what happened to the victims. On December 11th, so the night of the attack, just before 8 p.m., which was a couple of hours after Rafaela had returned from the market and had made dinner with her mother while Yusuf played on the floor around them, two people walked up the outdoor flight of stairs that led to the second-floor landing where Rafaela's apartment was. To understand what happens next, you need to have an understanding of the layout of Rafaela's apartment. Once you step through the front door and you go into the apartment, you would be standing in the middle of a hallway that stretched out to the left and to the right. The longer part of the hallway ran off to the left towards the combination kitchen and the living room area at the far end of the unit. Between the front door and the living room kitchen area, there was another doorway on the right side of the hall that led into Yusuf's little bedroom. If you turned right when you first walked into the hallway after coming into the apartment, you would almost immediately come to a closed door that led into the master bedroom. At exactly 8 p.m., the two people got off the stairs on the second floor landing and came to a stop directly in front of Rafaela's apartment door. Once there, they each reached down and touched the outside of their coat pockets, confirming that what was supposed to be in there was still there. Then they each pulled rubber gloves from those pockets and spent a few moments pulling first one set of gloves onto each of their hands and then a second set. Once they were ready, one of these two people rang the doorbell, and then they both leaned forward a few inches, straining to hear the sound of footsteps coming towards the door so they would be prepared for when it opened. Less than a minute later, they heard Rafaela's voice on the other side of the door asking who was there. One of the two people out on the landing calmly identified themselves and gave their reason for being there. After just a moment's hesitation, Rafaela opened the door. Instantly, one of the two people on the balcony, who were the attackers, pulled a heavy metal bar with a sharpened tip out of their jacket pocket. They lunged forward and they delivered a savage blow to Rafaela's head. As soon as Rafaela fell to the floor, her attacker reached into their jacket pocket and pulled out a sharp kitchen knife. Then they rushed forward until they were standing directly over Rafaela, and they reached down and they slit her throat from ear to ear. As Rafaela grasped at her neck, trying to stop the blood that was now pouring out of her, her attacker proceeded to stab her 11 more times. After this, the two attackers stepped over Rafaela's body, and then they turned left and began walking down the long hallway toward the kitchen and living area. As they pushed aside a child's scooter and toy trucks, they came face to face with Rafaela's 60-year-old mother. Paula had left the living room couch where she was sitting next to her grandson and was calling out in a panicked voice to her daughter, asking what was going on. Without hesitation, the same attacker who had just savagely attacked Rafaela raised the same sharpened metal bar and swung it at Paula's head. But the grandmother put up a fight, raising her arms to shield herself from this blow before pushing the attackers as hard as she could back down the hallway. However, the two attackers eventually overpowered Paula and they knocked her to the floor. And as soon as she hit the ground, one of the attackers leaned down and made a deep slash across the woman's throat. At the same time that was happening, the other attacker stepped past Rafaela's mother and headed into the small living area where 2-year-old Yusuf, still dressed in his trousers, socks, and a brightly patterned top, sat too terrified to make a sound alone on the small sofa. He watched as his murderer walked up to him, leaned forward, and with their weapon held in their left hand, they grabbed his shoulder, and then a moment later, they slid the point of the knife into the little boy's throat. With the entire family either dead or dying, the attackers turned and began walking back down the hallway back towards the front door. On their way, they poured lighter fluid on Paula and her daughter Rafaela. They also sprayed lighter fluid all over Yusuf's bedroom and the master bedroom. Then the attackers lit 3 separate fires around the apartment before heading for the front door. But as the attackers stepped out onto the second-floor balcony, they heard footsteps pounding down the enclosed stairway right above them. It was Mr. and Mrs. Cherubini. They had indeed smelled smoke, and they were coming down to help their neighbors. Taken by surprise, the attackers responded with immediate savage force. As one of the attackers slashed the throat of Mr. Cherubini, leaving him to bleed out where he fell, partway across the threshold of Raffaella's condo, the other attacker took off after Mrs. Cherubini, who had begun running, terrified, back up the steps to her attic apartment. By the time Mrs. Cherubini had managed to get back through the door of her own home, where police would find her dead, kneeling on the floor with her head in her hands, she had suffered 8 blows to the head and 34 stab wounds to her back and thighs. The only reason Mr. Cherubini did not die from this attack was because of a congenital malformation of his carotid artery that stopped him from bleeding out before emergency medical personnel had arrived and could take him to the hospital. By 8:15 p.m., the 2 killers had finished their work. They had stuffed their bloody gloves back into the pockets of their coats, they had gone back down the stairway that led into the courtyard, and they had disappeared. Just 5 minutes later, the 2 men who had been walking past Raffaella's apartment that evening along Via Diaz, they would look up and they would see flames and smoke starting to pour out of the second-story apartment window, and they would run back and discover the gruesome scene. The reason Olindo and Rosa's story was so shocking to police, and the reason it filled in all of these gaps about what happened, was because their story was actually just a detailed confession. The shy garbage collector and his tiny wife, who was obsessed with quiet and cleanliness, were the killers. Olindo confessed to killing Raffaella and her mother and slashing the throat of Mr. Cherubini. The details of Mrs. Cherubini's death are unclear, but Rosa would tell police that she remembered chasing Mrs. Cherubini back up the stairs, and as the terrified woman scrambled to get back into her apartment, Rosa recalled making an upward stab with her knife into the back of Mrs. Cherubini's thigh. As for little Yusuf, Rosa, showing no emotion, told police that she was the one who slit the boy's throat. When asked why they did this, Olindo and Rosa, who did not have children of their own and who seemed not only socially withdrawn but morbidly attached to one another, said that they could not stand the noise that their neighbors, the Castañas, made while going about their daily lives. And once Yusuf was born, the sound of him crying at night and playing with his toys and riding his scooter and sometimes screaming in toddler frustration was just too much for Rosa and her husband. According to a transcript of this confession, Rosa would say, "We just couldn't stand them anymore. He was always screaming and my head was exploding." Rosa and Olindo's issues with the Castañas came to a head on the afternoon of December 31st, 2005, roughly 1 year before the murders. On the second-floor landing right outside of Raffaella's apartment, Olindo and Rosa confronted Raffaella and her mother, Paula, about the noise coming from their apartment. And at some point during this confrontation, as Rosa swore and cussed out Raffaella, her husband, Olindo, wound up and hit Raffaella, knocking her to the floor, where she hit her head hard on the concrete. Before Raffaella could even get to her feet, Rosa and Olindo were hustling away back down the stairs, and as they did this, Rosa would call over her shoulder, "Do not dare report us or we will make you pay." But immediately after this assault, Raffaella contacted a lawyer and began talking about filing a complaint against the couple. Raffaella's father, Carlos, had tried to mediate a settlement between his daughter and this couple. He also had that soundproofing installed in Raffaella's apartment because he wanted his grandson, Yusuf, to be able to just keep playing like a little kid and not have anyone get mad about it. But nothing worked, and Olindo and Rosa continued to complain and cause problems. And so finally, not long before the murders occurred, Raffaella went ahead and filed a lawsuit against her neighbors. However, she did tell them she would drop it if they just paid her family 5,000 euros, or about $6,850. Furious and absolutely unwilling to pay, Olindo and Rosa decided that they would just have to murder the Castañas instead. On the night of the attack, so December 11th, 2006, when Raffaella came to the door and asked who was there, Rosa and Olindo called back and said that they were there to accept the terms of Rafaela's proposed monetary settlement, knowing full well, as soon as that door opened, they were going to murder Rafaela, they were going to murder her mother, her child, and anyone else who got in their way. After leaving the burning condo, Olindo and Rosa had gone back to their own home, disposed of their bloody gloves and weapons, they put their bloody clothes in the wash, they showered and dressed, and then they went out to a local restaurant, so it would appear that they had not been around when the crime was discovered. But, as Rafaela knew from her own experience, there are no secrets in small towns, and after the murders were discovered, many neighbors noticed that Olindo and Rosa did not seem all that upset about these horrible murders that had taken place, and they didn't seem remotely scared about the idea that there could be a killer or killers still on the loose. So that, combined with the fact that everyone in the complex knew about Olindo and Rosa's feud with the victims, had led several neighbors to tip off police that maybe they should look into this unassuming couple. And when the case against Rafaela's husband, Azuz, fell apart because he was totally innocent and had an alibi, this is exactly what the police did. Although the killers would later withdraw their very detailed confessions, the details they provided to police, combined with the fact that Mr. Cherubini would eventually come out of his coma and he would positively identify Olindo and Rosa as his attackers, was enough to send the couple to trial on October 12, 2008, almost 2 years after the Yerba massacre. At their trial, the police would explain that they bugged Olindo and Rosa's home with listening devices shortly after neighbors had brought up their suspicions around this couple. And so within days of the murders, Rosa was overheard on one of these listening devices saying to Olindo, "See how peaceful it is now? We can finally sleep well." On November 26, 2008, Olindo and Rosa were found guilty of first-degree murder. They were each sentenced to life in prison, where for the first 3 years, they would spend every daylight hour in solitary confinement.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.